Deadly Premonition was released in 2010 with little fanfare. Not much was known about a game that had been previously delayed because it aped Twin Peaks just enough for lawyers to smell blood in the water. A name change and a handful of character redesigns later, the game was still a tight homage to David Lynch's seminal television series, but it captured the imagination of those that would launch a vocal campaign to turn it into a beloved cult classic. At the time, critics and players alike compared it to that of a beautiful train wreck, a sight so terrible but compelling enough to be unable to look away. To say that Deadly Premonition was janky is being nice. It was a budget game launched at a budget price. Combat was clunky, technical hiccups were plenty, and the sound mixing was a little bit off. Some would argue that it was part of its charm. On the other hand, Deadly Premonition featured an amazing cast of beloved characters with their own unique charms and quirks, though none would be greater than that of the protagonist, FBI Special Agent Francis York Morgan, who channels his best Dale Cooper impression to fit the mold of an aloof and socially awkward fellow who is constantly mesmerized by the world around him. Deadly Premonition 2, A Blessing in Disguise, is the surprise sequel to Swery's debut work, and held the promise of more fun adventures with everyone's favorite FBI special agent. Trading the rainy Pacific Northwest town of Greenvale for the southern fried burg of Le Carre, Louisiana, York finds himself thrust into a high-profile murder investigation that might have a connection to a drug ring he's been trying to hunt down. By their nature, video game sequels are an opportunity to tell new stories with additional and pre-existing characters, but also make adjustments to the formula of the previous game by implementing new features and fixes. By that definition, Deadly Premonition 2 is a considerable letdown. In fact, I argue that the game represents a significant regression from the original Deadly Premonition. That's because A Blessing in Disguise is mired by crippling bugs and lazy design choices that, to me, make the creation of the sequel feel more like an obligation than a chance to do something new. In these uncertain, fluid, unprecedented, and extraordinary times, game studios have tried their best to manufacture a product while forced to work from home. This has to have some effect on development pipelines and other resources that I, as someone who has no game development experience whatsoever, have no clue about. I'm left to wonder how much of Deadly Premonition 2's woes can be attributed to the difficulties of COVID-19 or the developer rushing a product to the market. I'm inclined to believe the latter, given that no matter how many times Swery mentioned it on Twitter, the game's July 2020 release date always came as a surprise. Whatever the cause may be, the end result is that Deadly Premonition 2 performs terribly on the Nintendo Switch. It is plagued by technical problems that shouldn't have been allowed to ship without being addressed. After Jim Sterling took to Twitter about the game's numerous failings, developer Toybox initially stated they had no plans to put together a patch fix. Their attitude has since shifted after growing unrest connected to the depiction of a trans character paved the way for story rewrites and, yes, attempting to fix the more dubious technical problems. During this review, Toybox did release a patch that made some improvements, but made bizarre changes to address the depiction of a trans woman, but more on that later. Deadly Premonition 2's troubles go beyond framerate and buggy gameplay. The first game was an accidental renaissance, a goofy little murder mystery that ended up having enough heart and character that transcended the often mediocre gameplay. Those who invested themselves in Swery's Twin Peaks fantasy found lots to love. Deadly Premonition 2 doesn't achieve the same level of charm despite doubling down on everything that people loved about Francis York Morgan and his bizarre exchanges with the people in his orbit.
I know the chances are slim.
The game opens in 2019, where we find Morgan living in a sorry state. Hair unkempt and askewed, eyes almost permanently bloodshot due to an overuse of medicinal marijuana, and living in a squalid apartment. He's approached by FBI agents Aaliyah Davis and Simon Jones, who press him for his connection to the murders that took place in Le Carre, Louisiana, 2005. Enigmatic to a fault, Morgan recounts the circumstances surrounding an earlier case that caught his attention while investigating a drug ring in New Orleans. Jumping to the past, we find a younger Morgan who can't stop seeing the bright side of life even after his agency car was stolen and must use a skateboard for his primary means of transportation. Morgan's visit to Le Carre coincides with the murder of a young girl from a prominent family whose remains were found underneath a bridge in a strange ritualistic manner. Following the leads offered to him by an enigmatic voodoo priest, Morgan, along with a plucky young girl named Patty, run up and down Le Carre to unravel the mystery. To play Deadly Premonition 2 means to struggle with the level of banality that the first game didn't quite have. This could be attributed to a smaller, less memorable cast of characters, the overall emptiness of Le Carré, repetitiveness of combat environments, and a shorter story that plays its hand too quickly. York's unbridled enthusiasm for the world around him, no matter how dangerous, was one of the more compelling elements of the original game, and even though that's been dialed up to 11 for the sequel, it's just too hard to stay engaged throughout the entirety of the game's 4 chapters. There are many offenders that contribute to what I found to be a fairly miserable experience, but the one I'm most eager to point a finger at is its monotonous repetition. Each episode follows a structure of investigating a few points of interest as indicated by Hunan, an elusive voodoo priest who appears to York through visions. York will have to perform various actions or do favors for people to advance the investigation until he comes to portals that lead to the other world, the twisted, red-hued dimension where combat is the primary focus. You'll fight through labyrinths filled with strange creatures that can be dispatched with York's pistol until you reach a space where a crime has taken place, profiling the ghost images of those responsible for doing bad things. After that, you'll move through another enemy-filled maze that eventually leads to an arena where you'll engage in a 2-part boss battle. This particular sequence of events plays out more than once, and although there is nothing philosophically wrong with the structure, what bothered me was the lack of noticeable variations on the theme. No matter where York initiated contact with the other world, be it a plantation, a cold storage facility, or a stately southern mansion, the design of the labyrinth is always the same, a decrepit series of bland hallways covered by glowing red roots. The enemies you fight never change, and you'll encounter only 2 types for the better part of the game, and to be fair, the small mercy is that they aren't nearly as annoying to kill as the shadows in the first game. Exploring Le Carré during the day isn't much better by comparison. Despite the people you'll see walking around and the occasional vehicle passing by, the city is a total ghost town and seems to be suffering from a wild squirrel and dog problem. There's little to do outside of doing quests and shooting said dogs and squirrels to gain items in order to craft voodoo charms that offer meager stat upgrades. York can explore the city on foot or using his skateboard, which isn't as fun as that might sound. Tony Hawk, this ain't. The better way to get around is to simply activate the fast travel markers that lie at the front of each notable location and save yourself the monotony of getting around. York can interact with Le Carré's oddball residents who are happy to render services and ask his assistance with running errands. These side cases run the gamut of fetch quests and kill quests that are really just not interesting enough to warrant the time spent scouring the city in search of the objective. Overall, the time spent in the city is probably some of the worst parts of the game because a lot of the quests, even the story-related ones, are a complete waste of the player's time. There's one in Chapter 2 that has you running all over town to find items, one of which is locked out until a particular day of the week. And when you've gone through so much trouble to perform these errands, you're given an item that is 100% useless and offers no bearing on the case whatsoever. In Chapter 3, you're forced to follow a guide clear across town, and if you wander too far, you'll be forced to restart from the last checkpoint. This is especially annoying given the erratic pathfinding issues of the guide, who often doubles back for no reason, allows themselves to walk into dead-end areas, and pass through areas York cannot. Apart from its gameplay woes, Deadly Premonition 2 suffers from annoying bugs and terrible frame rates. The game performed at its worst whenever you are outside, which is a good 90% of the time, with the frame rate dropping to unacceptable levels. Despite their earlier response to such criticism, Toybox did release a patch that made the frame rate outdoors marginally better. Other glitches I encountered were odd occurrences of the controls simply not responding. While exploring a crime scene in the city, there was a moment where I inexplicably could no longer sprint. The problem fixed itself after loading a new location, but that was after making the slow, arduous walk to a fast travel marker. Far worse than that was the time in the other world when I randomly couldn't aim my gun to fight monsters unless I left the room I was already engaged in. Thankfully, the frame rate wasn't so much of a problem during the otherworld sequences, which are probably the best running in the game, though it had a tendency to lock up briefly anytime I walked into a room where enemies were meant to spawn.
But then immediately afterwards, she went insane.
When I think of what made the original Deadly Premonition click for me, I always look to its great collection of quirky weirdos who gave Greenvale its charm. None is greater than Francis York Morgan himself, who makes odd demands from those around him, speaks without a filter, and isn't shy about sharing his love of movies. As much as I love the guy, I couldn't rightly gel with York's presence in the sequel, mainly because the character feels a bit more self-aware. It was abundantly clear that people loved York's frequent trivia asides, and as a result, he's constantly talking about movies, listing off interesting factoids as they tangentially relate to the situation at hand. In many cases, York can't stop talking to himself when he's skateboarding around town, repeatedly throwing out the same quip every few seconds to the point of annoyance. He's unafraid to speak his mind, and from time to time, York gets on his soapbox to espouse his personal beliefs to those who act against them. The prime example of this being his stance on trans rights. If you've been keeping up with the news lately, there's been a lot of scrutiny towards the representation of Lena Dunham, a trans woman York meets during his investigation. In one scene, he expresses his frustration that no one is accepting of trans people, but when he meets Lena face to face, he falls into the practice of intentional dead naming, which is the use of a transgendered person's birth name. With all the attention paid to the situation, Swery had his team make modifications to set scenes in a patch. However, the result is simply muting the audio whenever York dead names, which has a tendency to call more attention to the issue rather than step away from it. Another behavior of York's that's a bit suspect is his practice of speaking in accents, namely the one used by Hunan. It's weird and about as uncomfortable as that time Tom Hanks' son Chet spoke patois at the Golden Globes.
Zach, let's go over our progress.
Deadly Premonition 2, A Blessing in Disguise is a disappointing follow-up to one of the most surprising and unconventional games to come out in 2010. Everything that made the original game a cult classic feels either uninspired or half-baked, from a largely unconvincing plot to its doubling down on particular character and gameplay quirks that don't quite stick the landing like before. The first Deadly Premonition succeeded because it was fascinating to watch the story unfold through a series of arcs that would eventually involve everyone in the town by the end of the game. For the sequel, many of its characters are little more than obstacles to overcome, and when you do, you barely hear from them ever again unless the story calls for them to make an appearance out of convenience. When you get right down to it, A Blessing in Disguise's attempt to recapture lightning in a bottle largely fumbles because of its severe banality and ho-hum drama.
Lisa's eye color matches that of her father's.
Dark Station gives Deadly Premonition 2, A Blessing in Disguise 2.5 stars.
This is it, Zach. A deadly premonition. You know, for some reason I'm getting butterflies. How about you?